And you're at the podcast. It's the show. More on Plutarch today. We're going to do Plutarch's life of Cato the Elder. So welcome to the Godward show. I'm your host, Casey. Blah, blah, blah. This is, as I said, this is going to be the episode summarizing and reflecting on Plutarch's life of Cato the Elder, a guy that I know many of you really would like. Famed as a traditional conservative, one who even resisted Hellenic culture for fear of its degenerate influence. But I can't resist starting this episode with one incident omitted in Plutarch's biography, which comes instead from Cicero, from his essay on duties. Cicero, tells a wonderful little story about Cato that goes like this. The elder Cato, who, when asked what was the most profitable thing to be done on an estate, replied, "To feed cattle well." What second best? To feed cattle moderately well. What third best? To feed cattle, though but poorly. What fourth best? To plow the land. And when he who had made these inquiries asked, "What is to be said of making profit by usury?" Cato replied, "What is to be said of making profit by murder?" End quote. So truly the Ezra Pound of his day, I guess. And this explains why when he was the censor of Sardinia, he actually expelled usurers and came down quite hard on all money-changing practices. For Cato, the best and most just way to live is certainly farming. And all of these cosmopolitans who move digits around are basically just snakes in his view. These were the middle golden, the high days, the middle golden days of the Roman Republic when optimism was still possible and Rome was on its way up. I hope you'll watch my other episodes on Plutarch's lives, by the way. I suppose I should put together a playlist, and if I keep doing these episodes on Plutarch, I will eventually. As I've said in previous episodes, the best thing about Plutarch is Plutarch himself, it turns out. It's the way we feel that we get to know the author when we learn to appreciate his searching and sensitive mind as he tells us about the outward events, not so much as the inner character and motivations of these famous men. He is certainly, that is, Plutarch is certainly as much an anthropologist and psychologist as he is a historian. Those are words, I don't know if you like those words or not. He's a philosopher. And this is why it makes me mad that in my 24 years of formal public schooling through to completing a PhD, not a single teacher ever assigned even a paragraph of Plutarch. What an absolute joke our national education curriculum has become, needless to say. Homeschool your children, teach them Plato, teach them Plutarch, teach them Thucydides. Anyway, Cato the Elder was born around 234 BC. Get your mental timelines out. 234 BC. And Plutarch tells us that he had red hair and gray eyes. He came from an undistinguished family, so the Romans classed him as one of the so-called new men. He was familiar from the start with manual labor, a modest lifestyle, and military campaigning. Plutarch reports that, quote, he always kept himself physically fit, and he developed and equipped himself with an eloquent style of speech as if it were a second body, a tool that is virtually indispensable if a man is to avoid a life of obscurity and failure. He was 17 years old and already fighting when Hannibal was invading Italy. Check my old episode on Polybius, by the way, for a summary of that war. From his military experience, his reputation grew. He himself, Cato, concluded that from all this military experience, it says, quote, he found defeating those who possessed gold more attractive than possessing it himself. Plutarch says that he had an early run-in with a man called Anacharsis, a Pythagorean, in whose teachings Cato recognized something like what he knew already as Platonic thought. Pleasure is the greatest and most damaging temptation, he learned, and it should be avoided, and the body is the mind's greatest misfortune in this view. Plutarch says that this talk with Nearchus made Cato even more attracted to a life of simplicity and self-discipline. But apart from this, it seems Cato was not much influenced by Greek thought until later in life, and as I'll tell you in a minute, he didn't even particularly endorse Greek thought. Cato spent many days working alongside his slaves on his estate and was known to eat the same bread and drink the same wine as them. But don't get the impression that it was because he had some moral compunction about the master-slave hierarchy. On the contrary, he was also known to sell his slaves when they got too old to be useful, something Plutarch suggests is sort of heartless. And he would severely punish and even kill his slaves if there was any hint of rebellion, criminality, and so on. Early on in his life, Cato's extraordinary character was recognized, and he soon acquired high office and befriended senators and other public officials. His eloquence was widely admired, but the main thing people admired about him was his way of life. Even at this time, Rome's aspiring young men had already become enthralled with the contests of oratorical bravado happening in the public square, while, according to Plutarch, it was a rare man who endured manual labor as his ancestors had, who was content with a plain evening meal, an uncooked breakfast, simple clothing, and an unpretentious house. Plutarch continues, all around them they could see people collapsing in the face of hard work and becoming enfeebled by a life of hedonism, whereas he, Cato, was impervious to both. It's hard to say that Plutarch is a conservative, but he shows in this biography that he's certainly able to appreciate traditional and conservative values. He tells dozens of small anecdotes about Cato, and shows how Cato tried to oppose what seemed to be the beginning of a long slide into imperial degeneracy that Rome would undergo in the following 2 centuries. So for example, Plutarch reports, once Cato compared the Romans to sheep, on the grounds that even when individual sheep had no reason for compliance, the whole herd still all followed their leaders. The same goes for you too, he said. When you all meet together, you let yourselves be led by people whose advice you wouldn't deign to listen to in private. This is what the old-fashioned ranchers would call horse sense, and it's the kind of thing that still resonates with me, even if I can't find it in myself. Perhaps I recognize something of Cato in memories I have of like my old grandpa who used to fish all the time, fought in the war, could build a car from scratch, and so on. Here are a couple of the sayings of Cato, reported by Plutarch. Once, when he was abusing someone who was overweight, he said, "What possible good is a body like that to Rome? The whole region, from gullet to groin, is nothing but belly." And another, to a wicked old man, Cato said, "Sir, old age has degradations enough without your adding the disgrace of depravity." On a campaign in Spain during the Second Punic War, Cato captured hundreds of towns, and he let his men enrich themselves with the booty, but according to himself, Cato took nothing other than the food and drink throughout the campaign. He said, "It's not that I find anything wrong with people seeking to enrich themselves from warfare, but my goal is to excel in virtue, not in wealth or avarice." And this brings me to another interesting facet of reading these old books. You can get halfway into an account of a guy like this and think he sounds just like your grandpa. I mean, he's, just a virtuous, good, conservative man. But then Plutarch will drop in something like this, where it says, quote, "Taking a detachment of 5 cohorts of legionaries with an escort of 500 cavalrymen, Cato subdued the tribe of the Lasitani and recaptured 600 deserters, whom he executed." End quote. And not to say that Cato did anything wrong here, but by today's mainstream moral standards, I'm sure this would be described as barbaric or needlessly cruel or whatever. But this was a brutal time, as I've tried to describe in previous episodes, and sometimes you gotta fight for it. Plutarch describes the campaign Cato led with his sort of friend and mentor Manius Acilius against Antiochus III Epiphanes. And this is the father of the Antiochus described in the book of Maccabees, the one who tried to subdue the Jews when the Jews objected to his putting up a statue in their temple. In my mind, all of this sort of confirms the story I see emerging between the time of like Herodotus and the time of Jesus. It was a conquer or be conquered world. And to do a little real talk here, it wasn't just the Jews who didn't want the empire's statue in their temple. Nobody wanted that. And it wasn't just the Greeks trying to put their statue in other temples. That was sort of the name of the game. And everybody was trying to do it to everybody else. Continuing, there's an interesting note in here about a visit Cato paid to Athens, and some lack of certainty about whether he delivered a speech in Greek or he had a translator speak it for him. But in any case, he was well received there. Plutarch says the reason he used a translator was not that he couldn't speak Greek, but because he was a staunch traditionalist. And this is pretty interesting. Cato used to mock those who admired Greek ways. Quoting, "For example, he made fun of Postumius Albinus, who wrote a history in Greek, and begged his readers to excuse him for doing so, by saying that this behavior was excusable only if the job had been forced on him by Amphictyonic decree." That's the Bureau of Delphic Oracle Interpretations or whatever, I guess. You get the idea. Anyway, Cato claimed that the Greeks were impressed by how quickly and concisely he spoke, since the translator had to use lengthy circumlocutions to express what took him, Cato, only a few words. His conclusion? The Greeks speak from the mouth and the Romans from the heart. Haven't we all had this impression when listening to some German try to say, down the hall and to the left? The implication is that the culture that takes longer to articulate whatever the subject matter is somehow degenerate, less vital, spiritually conquered, or whatever. Remember, this was sort of the outset of the Golden Era in Rome, where the balance of power was finally and basically permanently shifting from Greece to Rome. So in that way, this small observation makes sense. Greece was sort of a flagging late empire type civilization at the time, maybe comparable to Britain, whereas maybe Rome was more the equivalent of like the vital 19th century America, sort of the inheritor and renewer of the original culture. Finishing the point here, after the Romans defeated Antiochus, Plutarch says that, quote, Roman self-esteem increased until they felt that there was nowhere on land or sea over which they could not gain control. So this was in the year 191 BC or so. The Greek question, if we can call it that, really got under Cato's skin, it seems. Plutarch relates how even when he was an old man, I think 90 years old, and Carneades the academic and Diogenes the Stoic came to Rome, when everyone in town was head over heels for these guys, Cato gave them the cold shoulder and made a point of being unimpressed. He disliked the aspiration for intellectual pursuits which was flooding into Rome, since he was worried that the young men of the city might divert their energies there and find a reputation for eloquence more desirable than one gained from practical and military achievements. But apparently, or this is at least what Plutarch says, this wasn't just because he disliked Carneades or was jealous of the adulation he received. Instead, Cato felt a general disapproval of philosophy and a desire to denigrate Greek culture and learning as a whole. In fact, Cato even used to say that Socrates was a babbling bully who tried his utmost to set himself up as a tyrant in his homeland by subverting tradition and by enticing his fellow citizens to adopt unconventional views instead of their usual ones. There's a lot to say about this. This is pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, we like the Greeks, but there's a profound insight here that you might miss. It's sort of hard to sort out. We have this tendency to think of Socrates as the origin of Western thought, as being something traditional and based. But Cato predicted that Rome would be destroyed when it became infected by Greek learning. And I gotta say, the older I get, and the more I study and look at things, the more I feel the same thing about all of the French theory that kind of flooded into America and became all the vogue in the 1980s or so and still dominates, even among our guys. I don't know that it's really helping. I know that you kind of have to do it in order to become respectable in the views of, like, your fellow Romans, your countrymen, But I do predict the same kind of long-term downfall if we keep talking like that, because ultimately it's kind of masturbatory to read and to talk about Deleuze and to talk like that. What's more interesting about all this is that after describing all of it, Plutarch himself intervenes in his narrative, and he can't stop himself from saying, but now, that is like, in the year 110 AD or whatever when he's writing, now we can see that Cato's slander the slander of Cato was hollow, since we, Plutarch, speaking of himself, we live at a time when Rome is at a pinnacle of political success and has appropriated Greek learning and culture. So this is like 300 years later, right? This is kind of understandable, but also with the advantage of retrospect that we have, it might become something of a warning. I mean, after all, Plutarch was writing around 100 AD, even a bit later maybe, and I think viewed from a millennial perspective, like viewed from 10,000 feet, Rome was really in the midst of a tremendous upheaval, and its culture was actually almost flipping upside down, right under Plutarch's feet, even if he didn't recognize it yet. So, anyway, after Cato hung up the sword and shield, and after serving 10 years as a consul, he ran for the position of censor, and he won. This is an interesting civic position, one we probably need to bring back. According to Plutarch, quote, "This office is one of the crowning honors, and is, in a sense, the consummation of political life, since a censor wields a great deal of power, especially when it comes to assessing people's moral conduct." And to give you a sense of like what the censor did, I mean, by the way, it's spelled like censorship, so I suppose it's the same root word. Plutarch writes, quote, "The Romans thought that various aspects of a person's life should be subject to examination and scrutiny. His marriage, his procreation, his habits, his social life, to see what each man's desire and inclinations are, because they believed that these are much better indicators of a man's character than his visible public behavior. So, to stop people being tempted by personal whims to contravene the traditional and normal way of life, and to chastise and punish those who did, they used to appoint one of the so-called patricians and one of the plebeians, and they had the power to confiscate a man's horse and expel from the Senate anyone whose conduct was loose and immoral." This is really something, huh? And of course, the patricians resented Cato's non-noble background in this role, Plutarch says, because they knew perfectly well how immoral their behavior was and how far they had departed from traditional ways. Reading this sent me back to thinking again about legalism and authority and morality. My sense is that it's a perennial sort of question, probably one that doesn't have a perfect solution. Yes, people have a sheep-like nature, and they need to be shepherded to some degree. As any parent knows, on the other hand, if you shepherd too much and too smotheringly, it kind of has a stultifying effect, and the child will sort of continue drinking milk forever. So, on the other hand, there does seem to be this divine spark, latent at least, in all men. And I want to believe that in the right conditions, consciousness could shoot up and people could kind of come to life and they wouldn't need so much corralling. The idea of Cato walking around town, shaking his stick, looking at people whose habits and social life and marriage and procreation aren't happening just the right way, prodding them or shaming them somehow. I know a lot of you guys like this, but it really does seem annoyingly puritanical to me. But on the other hand, history proves he was right. Within 100 years or so, Rome was well on its way to becoming the center of decadence and depravity that it was during Jesus' lifetime. Well, anyway, these questions that perturbed me did not cause Cato to hesitate in his role as censor. Plutarch says that he offered no compromises at all. He openly threatened wrongdoers from the rostra, cried out that the city needed a thorough cleansing, and insisted that if they were sensible, the people of Rome would choose the most forceful doctor rather than the most amenable one. And what were the Hydra-like diseases plaguing the city at the time? Plutarch names luxury and effeminacy. And here's the amazing thing. After a speech like that, calling them a bunch of degenerate pansies, the Romans actually rose to the challenge and elected Cato their censor. So never let anyone tell you that Rome never had a sense of morality until the cult of Moses arrived. It's not true. Concerning this problem of extravagance, Plutarch has a lot to say. It seems that it wasn't a very popular sort of reform. I guess this isn't so surprising, as most people had been infected and corrupted by it already. So Cato tried a counterintuitive solution. By the way, before I read this to you, extravagance is just the owning of lots of things you don't need, right? And clearly that's not just an American problem now, but it's almost the definition of the empire now. It's true in, probably even less so in America than in places like, Indonesia and China, and I don't know about India, but it just seems like the new money first world is always grabbed by that idea of materialist consumer ownership culture, right? So anyway, that's extravagance, and this is what Cato did about it. He ruled that any items of clothing, vehicles, women's jewelry, and household utensils that were worth more than 1,500 drachmas each were to be reassessed at 10 times the value. The idea was that the increase in valuation would lead people to having to pay more tax as well, and he added a further penalty of 3 asses per 1,000 drachmas, hoping that the burden of these penalties and the sight of others paying less into the public treasury, in spite of their making the same amount of money, would make people change their ways. So, kind of nudgy, right? That's the Cass Sunstein project in some ways, I guess. Cato, needless to say, was no libertarian, okay? There's a whole very long paragraph about this, filling an entire page, but Plutarch's last sentence gives us a window into Plutarch's own philosophical thought on this. He says, "This goes to show that admiration of wealth is not related to any naturally arising feeling, but is an imposition caused by vulgar and alien opinion." That's very close to a condemnation of envy or covetousness. Along these same lines, Cato also kept a close eye on people who looked for loopholes in public policy. For example, he cut off pipes which people had been using to divert the flow of public water into their own houses, and he pulled down and demolished buildings which encroached on public land. Again, I understand that this could all spin out of control and become justification for total tyranny, but I guess, I don't know, I basically endorse Cato's activities as a censor because he seems to be as close to a philosopher bureaucrat as we could ever hope for, and he really did seem to have a sense of the public good. After he died, the people put up a statue of Cato with an inscription that said, "When the Roman constitution was in a state of collapse and decline, he became censor and set it straight again by effective guidance, sound training, and sensible instruction." A few more things and then I'll wrap it up quickly. Cato was a good father and husband. He used to say that anyone who hit his wife or child was laying hands on the most sacred of objects. He had one son in his first marriage who was breastfed by his own mother, which I guess was rare in those days, and he was proud of that, when most people with status sort of outsourced feeding to the wet nurse. And even more impressively, Cato took great pains to educate his son himself. Plutarch describes the instruction like this, quote, "He, Cato, taught him, the son, reading and writing, instructed him in the law, and acted as his physical trainer. In addition to teaching him how to throw a javelin, fight in armor, and ride a horse, he also taught him how to box and endure heat and cold, and made him a good enough swimmer to be able to force his way across even the turbulent and rough parts of a river." And also, when Cato was writing his history books, he wrote them in large and clear letters so that his son could refine his reading skills and acquire important knowledge, gaining, quote, familiarity with the history of his ancestors. And guess what? The kid grew up to be an awesome war hero and to marry the sister of Scipio. So as Plutarch says, the trouble was worth it. Dads matter. Finally, Cato destroyed the Carthaginians once and for all. I mean, he was old at the time during the Third Punic War, but I thought you'd like to hear how he was able to pull this off. Basically, he didn't trust them. The Carthaginians, who were a Semitic people living in what is now Tunisia, who practiced child sacrifice, it was Cato, above all, who urged and recommended to the Romans that they undertake this third war against Carthage. It's a complicated story, and I think you can read about it in Polybius. I don't know if actually Polybius goes all the way into the third one, but the gist of it is this. The word, he says, this is what Plutarch says, the words peace and treaty, Cato said shortly before he died, were for the Carthaginians just alternative ways of describing the postponement of the war that they were waiting for the opportunity to launch. Best beat them to it. Within 3 years of his death, Rome listened to his advice, destroyed Carthage, which was their last rival in the region, and sort of set the stage for their strong empire that lasted however long. A fitting tribute, I think, to a great life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Godward podcast. I know I told you that I was going to do a book by, I said D.T. Suzuki. It's actually Shunryo Suzuki. I'll try to get to this soon. I'm not actually in the mood much for this, but I know that people would like it, and it seems like a helpful and important kind of, I don't want to say like remedy, but breather from all of the kind of politics and so on. So I'll try to get through some of this again. I mean, it's been 10 years since I read it, so I want to read it again before doing an episode. And then, of course, I'm going to continue in Plutarch. I might do an episode pretty soon with Praise of Folly again, where we're going to talk about, I think he said Timoleon and somebody else. So there's a lot coming up. It's also Christmas season. I am going to do our secret stream on Friday, December 17th, but then I think we'll probably I'll probably take off and not do any episodes from then until the next secret stream, which would be what, on the... Oh, we got to think about that. We'll talk about that, because that would be New Year's Eve. I don't know if we should do a secret stream on New Year's Eve. Maybe we'll put it off by a week. So anyway, happy holidays, and yes, enjoy your life for a while. Bye-bye.